Hello, everyone. My name is Nicholas Preuth, and my presentation today is titled Parsing Ontology, Distinguishing Meta-Social Ontology from First-Order Social Ontology. The goal of my presentation is to analytically define, introduce, and distinguish the field of meta-social ontology in the philosophy of social science from first-order social ontology. My presentation will proceed in three parts. In the beginning, I will give an analytical definition of meta-social ontology and situate it within the literature. Then I will examine some underdeveloped meta-social ontological premises in Brian Epstein's The Ant Trap. And finally, as a proof of concept to show the usefulness of this distinction, I will demonstrate how the field of meta-social ontology will allow us to reframe the critical realism debate between Roy Bhaskar and Tuka Kaitasoya as a meta-social ontological debate, rather than a social ontological debate. So, in 2019, Richard Lauer wrote an article entitled Is Social Ontology Prior to Social Scientific Methodology? That was published in the Journal of the Philosophy of the Social Sciences, Volume 49, Issue 3 in 2019. Here in this article, Richard Lauer's arguments centered on a methodological relationship between ontology and the empirical success in social science. This was what he called an argument for ontology matters rather than an argument in social ontology. 2 years later, this article received a lot of attention in the Journal of the Philosophy of the Social Sciences, Volume 51, Issue 1 in January of 2021, where four prominent philosophers of social science, Harold Kincaid, Daniel Little, Richard Lauer, and Simon Lohse, responded to Lauer's 2019 article. Here, the numerous of these authors were engaging in methodological debates about the relationship between ontological theorizing and empirical success in the social sciences. Some of them chose to identify this sort of debate as meta-ontology or meta-social ontology. So here Simon Lohse actually uses the words meta-social ontology, and Lauer does as well, whereas Little and Kincaid label their contributions as ontological contributions. Nevertheless, I argue that these contributions in the philosophy of social sciences is different from social ontology. So, whereas social ontology is the field of study that answers substantive questions regarding the nature, properties, and composition of the social world, meta-social ontology answers methodological questions regarding the role and importance that theories of ontology play in social science research. So in social ontological discussions, these are the types of arguments, debates over questions like what are the building blocks of the social world? Do social kinds exist? What about norm systems and social structures? What are social entities? Can groups have causal influence, etc.? All these sorts of questions that try to understand what the social world is built off of, what the social world is composed of. Meta-social ontology, on the other hand, does not engage with these substantive questions about the social world, but rather takes a step back and tries to answer methodological questions about the relationship between ontological theorizing and the role that ontological theorizing can then play in the conduct of social scientific research. I have gone ahead and identified three research questions in meta-social ontology, which I think are important questions that can guide the field. The first one is, what philosophical approach best guides the practice of ontological theorizing? So here, this is a question about whether ontological theorizing is best done as an a priori metaphysics practice, or if it's better informed by a posteriori empirical social scientific research. The second question then is a debate over to what extent should we be existentially committed to our ontological framework of the social world. So when we talk about social facts like government, ruling class, etc., should we be realist about these? Are these real social facts that are tangible like copper or zinc in our natural world? Or are they instrumental? So this is a debate between realism versus instrumentalism, where instrumentalism is the belief that the the theories of the social world are helpful guides for inference and to help us organize the social world, but they are not real concrete social facts that exist in the world. And finally, I have the question, does ontological theorizing have a concrete effect on real empirical research? So this is a question about whether or not ontological theorizing is actually useful for social scientists who are conducting research. Do we think that scientists actually benefit from having an ontological framework? Or could it be the case that the empirical work that scientists do is completely independent of the ontological theorizing that the philosophy of social science engages in? So all three of these questions are questions in what I would call this field of meta-social ontology. And we can go ahead and identify some potential positions that philosophers have taken and philosophers could take within this field. So the first would be a priori realism. Examples here would be John Searle and Brian Epstein, which is the belief that the best way to do ontological thinking is by using philosophical metaphysics, a priori thinking, and that our subsequent ontologies should be real, that they are real, they represent real social facts in the world. On the other hand, we could agree that a priori metaphysics is the best way to engage in ontological thinking, but the resultant ontologies that we create are actually just instrumentally useful, that they are helpful ways to organize and think about the social world, but that they don't represent real social facts in the way that we have natural, concrete, tangible facts. On the other hand, we could have the position of a posteriori realism. And some examples here are the philosophers Daniel Liddell and Harold Kincaid, where the realism is, as Liddell says, that ontological theories are advanced as substantive and true statements of some aspect of the social world, but the a posteriori aspect, in contrast to the a priori aspect, is that these theories are then fundamentally informed by empirical social scientific research, and they are corrigible. So they're not done by philosophical metaphysics, they are informed by empirical research. On the other hand, we could have a posteriori pragmatism. And here, Richard Lauer introduces himself as a proponent of this by saying that he believes that the function of ontological statements are pragmatic, that such statements may open new possibilities that can further scientific aims, all without requiring a realist attitude. So a posteriori pragmatism would be the belief that empirical social scientific research is the best way to engage in ontological thinking, but in contrast to realism, that the function of ontological statements is they're pragmatic. It's to help push science further. And of course, there's even an interesting question here about whether there is a distinction or a difference between pragmatism and instrumentalism. So there's a lot of different terms, and the goal here is just to introduce meta-social ontology as a distinct field that has its own purview separate from the field of social ontology. And I've gone ahead and identified some of these questions. We've talked about some potential stances that philosophers could have. And I want to end this section by saying that this is not a comprehensive list. There are, I'm sure, all sorts of different positions you could take about the best way to engage in ontological thinking and the methodological relationship between ontological thinking and research in the social sciences. But at the end of the day, I argue that all of this is not social ontology because we're not engaging in substantive arguments about the composition of the social world, but rather this is meta-social ontology. So now I want to move on, taking our framework of meta-social ontology. I want to demonstrate how there are some underdeveloped, tacit meta-social ontological statements and premises in Brian Epstein's 2015 work titled The Ant Trap: Rebuilding the Foundations of the Social Sciences. So, the central claim of Epstein's work was to demonstrate that ontological individualism is false, where he defines ontological individualism as the belief that social facts do not supervene on individualistic ones. Now, the supervenience thesis is a little bit contentious, and so the better way to define ontological individualism usually is that it is the theory that the social world is entirely constituted by facts about individual actors and nothing else. So only facts about individuals can make up the social world. And Epstein wants to argue that this is false, that we have been misled. How does he support his claim? Well, here's his rationale. I've highlighted in bold the most important parts, but I'll read this quote. He says, using the example of the German biologist Rudolf Virchow, who was investigating cell theory, he says, Virchow's flawed ontology damaged his scientific practice. Because he insisted on the exhaustive determination of anatomical facts by cellular facts, he committed himself to thinking of the body as divided into cell territories. And this led him onto some radically mistaken tracks when it came to certain theories. Virchow's commitment to a cell territory version of cell theory derailed his explanations. To explain bone necroses as transformations of cell territories into other cell territories, it's not just awkward or psychologically misleading, but something between a distortion and a flat mistake. Despite Virchow's expertise with a microscope, his commitment to cell theory led him to subdivide tissues into cells where there are none. And that led to poor theories about how anatomical features come to be, how they are changed or destroyed, and what they do. So if we were to sum up Epstein's argument just then, he starts off with the premise that ontological mistakes lead to scientific mistakes. And he supports this using the example. And the example he gives is that the social ontology of ontological individualism, in particular, Rudolf Virchow's cell territory theory, then subsequently led to scientific mistakes in the study of anatomy. And therefore, he wants to conclude that we should thus doubt the veracity of ontological individualism and utilize a priori metaphysics to build a better, more concrete, more correct ontology. In his own words, he says that this is a seed of doubt about ontological individualism. We cannot trust the prevailing dogma. We cannot trust it until we engage in more careful metaphysics. Let's go ahead and take a careful look at this argument using the idea of metasocial ontology, the distinction between metasocial ontology and social ontology that I've just introduced. Highlighted in red, we have a meta-social ontological premise. That is, ontological mistakes lead to scientific mistakes. That is a straightforward answer to the third question that we've identified in the purview of metasocial ontology, which is, what is the relationship between ontological theorizing and the practice of empirical science? Epstein says there is a strong relationship, and that is that ontological mistakes lead to scientific mistakes. Then in blue, we have the example. This is what he uses to support that premise. That's Virchow's cell territory theory, which was basically based on ontological individualism, led to scientific mistakes in the study of anatomy. Then he concludes a double conclusion. The first one is a ontological conclusion. He says, we should thus doubt the veracity of ontological individualism based on his meta-social ontological premise that ontological mistakes lead to scientific mistakes. And then he follows that up with a meta-social ontological conclusion that we should also use a priori metaphysics to build a better, more correct ontology. So we have embedded in Brian Epstein's work on social ontology about ontological, the falseness of ontological individualism, we have concrete meta-social ontologies that are not explicitly stated, that are embedded in his work, answering the three questions that I've identified in the field of meta-social ontology. And those are, does ontological theorizing have a concrete effect? Yes, it leads to scientific mistakes. Something along the lines of, if the ontological theories are a framework, and when that framework's wrong, then our ability to investigate the world is going to be inadequate and error-ridden. And he further answers that obviously the best way to engage in ontological theorizing is through a priori metaphysics, and that of course we need to be realist about the social world, that our ontologies, because they lead to scientific mistakes, they're not pragmatic or instrumentalist inferences that organize the social world. These are real social facts, and it's important to get them right. Well, there's something really interesting about Brian Epstein's this premise of reasoning from metasocial ontological premises to ontological conclusions. So here in Brown, I have his original argument, which is that ontological mistakes lead to scientific mistakes. This is a metasocial ontological premise. And his subsequent ontological conclusion that, therefore, we should doubt the veracity of ontological individualism. However, I argue that Epstein actually cannot make this argument, that you cannot reason from metasocial ontological premises to ontological conclusions. And to demonstrate that, I've provided 3 more examples following this same logic of argument with different meta-ontological stances and different ontological conclusions, demonstrating that they all could just as well work. So we see here that you could believe ontological mistakes do in fact lead to scientific mistakes from a meta-social ontological premise and still believe that ontological individualism is correct, but we need to carefully support its building block foundations. On the flip side, you could believe that from a meta-social ontological standpoint, that ontological mistakes do not lead to scientific mistakes, but that ontological individualism may or may not be wrong. It's just that scientific research operates totally independently of this conclusion, that the researchers who are working on empirical research are not keeping ontological frameworks in mind when they're actually engaging in sociological studies, etc. So this is to demonstrate that it's not enough to take a meta-social ontological premise to conclude an ontological conclusion, because meta-social ontological premises, because they are separate fields, they are separate ideas, that they cannot be used in support of ontological premises. So what I've done is I argue that Epstein could, the best that Epstein can do with his argument is reason from a meta-social ontological premise to a meta-social ontological conclusion. So above the asterisks, I have Epstein's argument that we've gone over a couple of times, and below in the purple, this is me changing his argument to what I think is feasible based off his stated premises in his work, which is that the meta-social ontological premise is that Virchow's dogmatic commitment to cell territory theory led to scientific mistakes in the study of anatomy. So it's not that ontological individualism in ontological position led to scientific mistakes. It's specifically a meta-social ontological premise that Virchow's dogmatic commitment to his ontology led to mistakes. And therefore, we cannot conclude an ontological conclusion, but what we can conclude is a meta-social ontological conclusion, one such that dogmatic commitments to ontology leads to bad science. Therefore, scientists should be fabulous and anti-dogmatic about their ontologies. So I argue anyway that based off of Epstein's stated premises, all he can actually argue for is that dogmatic commitments to ontology leads to bad science, that he can't say anything about the wrongness of ontological individualism solely based off the meta-social ontological position that ontological mistakes lead to scientific mistakes. So then, in conclusion, adhering to that distinction, I truly believe that the use of meta-social ontological premises to support first-order social ontological claims devalues meta-social ontological debate, and that rectifying this philosophical mistake would permit fruitful and substantive exploration of meta-social ontological claims that can result in productive progress to our discipline. So all of that's to say that metasocial ontology is a ripe field. There are all sorts of different positions that one can take, and there's a lot of debate to be had there about to help us understand the social world. And we're doing we're doing the field a disfavor by sneaking in, embedding metasocial ontological premises, and then concluding social ontological facts from them. So then finally, to wrap up my conclusion, to wrap up my presentation as a proof of concept, I want to demonstrate how the field of metasocial ontology can be used to reframe Roy Bhaskar's and Tuka Kaitasoya's contributions to critical realism. So Roy Bhaskar and Tuka Kaitasoya have normally been characterized as having a social ontological debate between one another. But I argue that that's not the case, because when you look at their ontologies, the way that they think about the social world, they agree about the division between the empirical, the actual, and the real domains, and causal power and emergent properties. The key difference between Bhaskar and Kaitasoya is Bhaskar thinks that Kantian metaphysics, a priori transcendental realism, is the best way to argue for this ontology, his particular ontology of the social world. And Kaitasoya disagrees. He thinks that the best way to do it is by using aposterori premises that don't involve any ampliative inferences whose validity are taken to be a priori. So really what we have here is a disagreement that is a meta-social ontological disagreement that still keeps intact their social ontologies, and thus adhering to this distinction between meta-social ontology and social ontology can help us reassess, reframe the contributions, these seminal contributions of these two very important figures. That is it. Thank you guys for your time, and that is all.